The World Economic Forum's annual meeting of the new champions, also known as Summer Davos, will take place from July the 1st until July the 3rd in Dalian, China. Over 1,500 leaders from business, governments, and civil societies will convene for the meeting. The theme of this year is Leadership 4.0, succeeding in a new era of globalization. At a time of heightened geostrategic competition, the meeting will identify models for cooperation and highlight how businesses can shape the future of the fourth industrial revolution to deliver sustainable and inclusive growth. Ahead of the meetings, I talked to David Aikman, the WEF's Chief Representative Officer in China. Here's his take on globalization 4.0. Mr. Aikman, what a pleasure to see you on CGTN.
Tian, good to see you again.
Summer Davos coming.
That's right.
Well, your busy time, but what exactly is globalization 4.0, as that was the major theme of this year?
Well, I think this meeting, Summer Davos, is a continuation of our meeting in January, where we first raised this theme of globalization 4.0. And it really is talking about the new era that we're living in. The past waves of globalization were around the Industrial Revolution or after the Second World War, when we created many of the modern institutions. The most recent wave of globalization was really at the end of the century and probably finished with the global financial crisis. But now we're in a new phase, and we feel that leaders really need to understand the dynamics of this new phase of globalization, which is around the technological disruption, which is coming from the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's around the environmental crisis that we're facing as a civilization. It's around the incredible inequalities that are emerging in society between the haves and the have-nots. And it's about heightened regional competition. We're seeing changing dynamics in the geostrategic landscape of the world. And we really feel that leaders need to be aware of these dimensions and need to hone their skills, because almost all of these dimensions really require more cooperation, not less.
Talking about geopolitical issues, that is really on top of the agenda for many in their minds. So with the two of the world's largest economies now apparently in the mood of debates, if not conflicts, what can WEF do, really? Many say it's already starting to decouple the two economies, particularly when it comes to technologies. Now, Summer Davos mainly is focusing on innovation and technological development. Do you see that as a concern when you are organizing this meeting?
From our perspective, it's indicative of the fact that we're not just living in a multipolar world, we're really living in a multi-conceptual world. And different countries, not just the United States and China, many countries around the world have very different views and diverse views about how technology should be governed, how these new technologies can best be applied to solve society's challenges, how these technologies should be governed in terms of the real economy, and so on. And in that kind of situation, we feel what's very important is to create the dialogue between those different systems, because we're not going to change the minds of different leaders in their attitudes towards technology. Our job is to create the dialogue between these different concepts and to try and see where we can learn from one another. Because in fact, these different ideas about technology being governed can then be applied in other contexts.
Some suggest this is probably the beginning of a possibility of a Cold War right now. So WEF have been through the cold years of the Cold War, survived it, prosper and thrive during the ages of globalization. So David, from your perspective as the representative of WEF here in China, how do you see people's different concepts of where we are and where we're heading for? What can you do about that?
The world is very different than the era of the Cold War, and I think the situation between, let's say, the United States and China is very different than the situation with the Soviet Union. Our global economy is so much more interconnected and interlinked now. And while, Cold War is a nice headline-grabbing title, I know so many people working behind the scenes to try and get cooperation and try and avoid this kind of mentality from sticking. And I think that's why, you know, this annual meeting of new champions this year is particularly relevant in terms of giving leaders that awareness of the dynamics, trying to really help them understand what's happening in terms of these big changes and these big features of globalization 4.0. We're hoping to make some announcements particularly around the environment, where we're working very hard with the Chinese government in terms of protecting biodiversity and working to save tropical forests. So some exciting news coming out there. We also just recently announced a strategic partnership with the UN to focus on particularly the Sustainable Development Goals, but also how we can work on climate, on health, on women's empowerment, you know, really mobilize the business sector to come to the fore on these issues. Because what we're also seeing with new business models and with new consumption patterns is the sense of, you know, people being left behind, of the stakeholders like business and society not doing enough to protect the environment and the workers, is something even here in China is growing in awareness. So many of our sessions will be focused on that, and also trying to build momentum behind those successful collaborations, trying to get more companies involved in specific initiatives, I think will be really helpful.
The importance of leadership and the quality of leadership. Well, of course, that's always an important topic for years. What about that? Particularly, how will the type of leadership that has been tested throughout the years, together with the new leadership that are coming up among emerging economies, how will bring these two different groups of thinking, experiences together?
We also structure our discussions in a way to try and foster that mutual learning, because I think for leaders, it's, you know, I talked about the awareness, you know, it's really making sure that our leaders are aware of the challenges in the world. I mean, I was surprised when I read the statistics from last year that 82% of the wealth created last year went to 1%. And this is a shocking statistic in terms of the inequality, and I think speaks to some of the social fractures that we're seeing. And when we see those in one part of the world, the experiences that leaders are having there could be shared with leaders in other part of the world before it's too late. So it's not only about the awareness, it's also about having that foresight and being able to look over the horizon to see what's coming.
Two specific questions. One is about China. China's economy, of course, has always been the growth engine of the world for quite some time. But now, restructuring of the economy together with the trade war and also the uncertainty of the global economy also puts China's economy with a question mark. Now, David, tell us your understanding, I mean, Web's understanding of where China's economy is and where is it heading for our international audience.
You know, China, in a way, we talk about China's slowdown, we talk about the pressure which is on China, which is very real. But even with that pressure, the growth that China is generating still represents, you know, the size of a major economy being added to the world economy every year. So I don't think we should overplay the story that the engine of growth for the world is coming to a complete stop. It's under pressure, yes. What I think is interesting is that, you know, this is happening at a time when China's domestic economy is undergoing incredible changes. So the fact that domestic consumption is increasing, for example, is taking some of the pressure off the export side of the economy. At the same time, you know, we still see risks in terms of the high debt levels or, you know, potential housing crisis. So, you know, I don't think China's out of the woods and we can't all breathe a sigh of relief. But I think the way in which the economy is being managed is still within the parameters that are expected. There's still major contributions to global growth coming from China, and that should be recognized and that should be put in its context. Because all too often we look at the headline which says, you know, percentage drop, or, you know, but when you think about it in real terms, China's contribution to the global growth, China's investment into infrastructure and the potential for even greater future growth leads us to still feel quite optimistic about the state of the Chinese economy.
And the other thing, of course, is about Europe. Now we know that the EU, at least for the moment, is having difficulty coming up with its own leader, as we have just observed recently. And also, well, the geopolitics are evolving, as many believe. Europe has so far failed to come up with some kinds of a concerted voice about where it stands in the overall situation. World Economic Forum is not a European platform, but it is based in Europe, started in Europe. So many wonder, David, what's going to be the relevancy of World Economic Forum? And when it's moving to China for the Summer Davos for years, is World Economic Forum thinking very differently now?
Well, you know, I think you said it very well. I mean, we are a global institution that is working on projects which affect all industries and all countries around the world, but we do care a lot about what happens in Europe. And especially because what's happening in Europe in terms of the social divide and the inequality and the crisis which is emerging around governance has lessons for the rest of the world. And so it's important to understand what's happening, to learn from what's happening, and to see where we can create collaborative projects that can be helpful. You know, more importantly, though, the world is changing. You know, 60% of global growth last year came from emerging markets. So for us, it's indicative of the way in which the global balance of economic power is shifting. And here it's absolutely fundamental that we're in China, that we're in Asia, that we're understanding what's happening with those emerging markets, that we're building collaborations that assist those emerging markets to have a greater voice in the multilateral system. I mean, it's absolutely fair and correct.
Many believe it takes decades to build bridges. For example, those that have been established during the years of globalization, which global supply chain, people-to-people relations, education, health, you name it, are linked around the world. However, it only takes a very short period of time to burn all of these bridges. What WEF has been aspiring to achieve through hard work for decades might be destroyed with some kinds of geopolitical games for a few. What do you make of this possibility?
I think we have to differentiate between the eye-catching headlines and what's really happening. It will take a long time to unwind global supply chains, and it will take a long time to damage and destroy the cooperation, the collaborations that have been built up, because globalization has been systemic. And the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution don't respect borders or regions, or they're universal in their application. And so as a world, we have to grapple with cooperation and collaboration. We have to figure it out, because you can have clean air in one country, but if the whole planet's atmosphere is destroyed, that won't matter. And the interconnected nature of the crises that we're dealing with around the environment, or around making sure we have a stable business environment with our digitally interconnected world. These cannot be easily undone and unraveled. These cannot be easily destroyed, no matter what the changing geopolitical will. And that's why, we're bringing everybody together and really getting them to focus and understand this interconnectedness, this need for the systematic approach, and then to work together, and hopefully through that we can rebuild some of the trust which is damaged. I think trust is easily broken and destroyed, but the underlying systems hopefully will be more resilient than any month's headline.
David Aikman from the World Economic Forum. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.